Hello, my name is Ilya Feinberg, and welcome to the Finecraft. Today we're going to look at the UX design principles for CanvasApps. So what is UX all about? Contrary to popular belief, it's not about the graphics or how nice the app looks. It's about making a human connection, creating an experience with which people would want to interact. So, in this presentation, we're going to talk about a few aspects of UX. We're going to cover things like who is this for, what's the difference between UX and UI, understanding the user, how to pick the right screen and the right layout for your app, how to build proper navigation, how to present data in such a way that it is readable and efficient on any screen size. We're going to talk a bit about color and how that affects building our apps. We're going to talk about text and fonts and how to use them. We're going to discuss branding and branding guidelines, and of course the impact of UX on performance. So, who is this for? This is really for anyone who builds Canvas apps. It used to be that mobile apps were built by whole teams of people, developers, UI designers, project managers, and so on. But nowadays, it's often very small teams or even a team of one maker, citizen developer, or a pro developer who builds the Canvas apps. So it's very important to learn the basic principles. This presentation is not going to make you a professional UX designer, and it's really not the point. It's about teaching you the basic principles of UX design so that you can make apps that are, well, at least good enough. Because the worst thing that can happen is that people will not use the app because they don't want to use the app. And in that case, well, it just doesn't exist. This is a bit of a complicated topic. UX and UI and the difference between them. So, UX and UI are not the same thing. Let's talk about that. A design can be absolutely beautiful, but entirely unusable. Or, on the contrary, can be fairly simple, but very useful and very functional. And that really is the most important part. The graphic part is what the UI is all about. So the images, the colors, the fonts, things like that. UX is about the overall experience. How easy was it to find what I'm looking for? How much time did it take me to get there? And what was my experience getting there? So UI is the how it looks part, which is just a small part of the overall how it works part, which is the UX. Let's look at the sample app. It is implemented in different ways, but has the exact same functionality. And it is actually based on an example that I saw with one of our customers. So we see here on the left that we have black text on blue, not entirely readable, and the text is fairly small, especially if we consider that this app was clearly made to run on a phone. We see that the title bar really serves no purpose aside of being a title bar. We see that the space on the screen is not really well utilized, so there's just a couple of buttons there and a lot of white space. When you have a small device, you want to make every part of the space that you have functional. The order or the menu items does not reflect their importance. So the About the app, it would not be the first thing I would click on, right? Help, routes, maps. Well, this app was clearly made for someone working in the field. Someone who needs the map and needs the routes. So at the very least, it would make sense to see those buttons as the first ones that we see on screen. And so the larger issue is that we have the start menu. Instead of getting access to the functionality directly, we need to go through that start menu every time we want to get anywhere in the app. That's not entirely convenient. And as the last issue is that all this app is text. There's no icons that we can see, and there's no graphical representation of anything that can be a shorthand for the functionalities that we're looking for. Now let's look at the same app on the right. Clearly, it's a much better experience. First of all, there's enough contrast between the text and the background, right? So white on dark blue is much better than black on dark blue. The title of the app doesn't take as much space as before. The app immediately opens showing a functional screen, the map. The app areas are represented both as icons and as text. So for the most part, you would just look at the icons, but if you for some reason forget what the icon means or use the app for the first time, you also have the text to explain what it does. The button highlights, so when they are activated, echo the same color that you have on the title bar, which creates a nice contrast. And finally, the placement of the buttons finally reflect the actual priorities of the user. So we have the map first, you have the routes, you have help in case you need it, and we have more. And in the more, we probably have the about button and some other buttons which are rarely used by the user. So you would notice that some of the changes that were made are functional and some are visual, and both are important for a good overall result. And you would also notice that we did not make some kind of elaborate designs in Photoshop to achieve a good visual style. Everything we did with the tools and the icons and the colors that are available in PowerApps out of the box. You notice that we also made changes to the order of the menu items. We made those changes based on assumptions of what the user actually needs. But how do we actually know what the user needs? What if it's some kind of a highly specialized app that we don't understand? How do we tailor it specifically to the user needs? Well, that's what the next chapter is all about. Understanding your user. There's a very easy way to understand the user. You can just, talk to them. But of course, don't expect them to just tell you how the app should look or should work. The questions you need to ask are: what is your role? What is your normal workflow? On what device do you usually open the app? Is it one or multiple? In what circumstances do you use the app? Do you use the app often or seldom? What areas or functionalities of the app are the most time sensitive or the most important? You don't need to write long design documents to build a small Canvas app or even a bigger Canvas app, but you do need to be able to ask the right questions, because eventually that will be a crucial part of the acceptance process. So let's look at those questions and see what we can learn for each one of them and how it can affect our design. What is your role? Do you know what people in this role do? What are their responsibilities? What are the goals? What are the motivations? That can affect how you design your app. Moreover, perhaps for specific roles, the same functionalities you're trying to implement already exist in other apps. What is your normal workflow? Understanding the normal workflow, the steps and the stages within which a person works, can help us design a better app that would give quicker access to the features and functionalities that we're looking for. On what device do you usually open the app? Is it one or multiple? If, for example, everyone uses the same device type and the same device size, it will be a bit easier for you to design the app. You can build it for a specific screen size and even make it look native for a specific operating system. If it's multiple devices, there's also a good chance that on devices of different sizes, the app is also going to be used differently. So you might want to adjust that as well. Build different layouts and different screens for devices of different sizes. In what circumstances do you use the app? Depending on how you use the app, is it in the office, is it on the road, is it in your car? Even the weather can decide how you design your app. For example, if it's a cold weather, most likely the user is going to use gloves, therefore the UI elements will have to be a bit bigger. In a vehicle, it might be the case that the app is primarily used in landscape mode, therefore you will need to design your UX appropriately. All those considerations can drastically alter how your app actually looks like in the end. So as we saw before, depending on which functionality you're going to use first and which second, you're going to want to place the items on the menus differently. Items that are often used can be placed first and foremost in the menus, and items that are used seldom can be placed somewhere else, like in the More menu. What areas of the app are the most time sensitive? In your app, you may have a process to collect data. If, for example, you need to collect this data rapidly from multiple people in a short amount of time, then you might want to implement a different way to do it. For example, using an editable grid instead of a form, or something else that allows rapid input. Now, let's look at how to pick the right screen for the job. Actually, deciding what kind of screen do you want is the first decision you're faced with when you create a new Canvas app. And often, at this stage, you don't even know yet what kind of screen do you want. Is it a phone? Is it a tablet? And especially if you haven't asked the user before or haven't done any kind of design work, well, you just might not know. Of course, you can change it at a later stage, but if you start building the app at a certain size, it will be a bit difficult. And the more you go, the more difficult it will become. So before even getting to that decision, you might want to do the preliminary design work we discussed so that you know exactly what kind of screen size you need. So what's the easiest way to design an app without actually, designing it? You can do UX prototyping. Essentially, you can draw the target design of the app and decide with the user whether it's a good fit for them or not. Now, there's a few ways to go about it. Of course, you can do like the full color prototypes, and you can use professional tools like Adobe XD, but while it's very nice, it's not always necessary. In most cases, to have a good understanding of what the app is going to look like and whether the user will be happy with it or not, it can be as easy as a wireframe prototype on a napkin. It doesn't have to be a napkin, it can be a page, it can be a Visio, it can be something fairly simple. But at the very least, you will have the understanding between you and the user what you're actually going to achieve and whether that result is something that you're both going to be happy with. If you do, however, want to build a more rich prototype with full color controls, it's not that difficult actually, because most vendors will actually help you do that. Microsoft, Apple, and Google all provide UI kits, which you can download and use the element from them to design your prototypes. It is very much in the best interest of all those vendors to enable you to design apps with the best experience possible. I've added here links to UI kits from several vendors, Microsoft, Google, and Apple, that you can use to design your own prototypes. But do you really have to design the app only for one device type? I'm sure you heard about the concept of responsive apps, which is one app that runs on multiple devices, or as they call it in the design world, multiple design surfaces. So in fact, we can see here that we have this app, which is clearly made to be as a desktop app, but if you open the same app on a tablet, you would see this. And if you open the same app on a tablet in portrait mode, you'll see this. And on a phone, this. As you clearly see, those are entirely different experiences, and in that case, they're also even made for different roles. So you would have the person in the office that works on the orders, you would have the person in the warehouse working on a tablet, and you would have the person delivering the orders working on a smartphone. And each one of them needs different experience and different kinds of data. So yes, you can make responsive design in PowerApps, but the question is, should you? Well, there is a few pros and cons to consider. The benefit, of course, is that you have one app that runs on multiple devices. The downside is that building that app becomes a bit harder, and maintaining that app becomes also a bit harder. Remember that you need to provide an entirely different experience for each device category. So if you just take a table and stretch it down to a phone size or app to a desktop size, that is not responsive design. That is just stretching UI elements, which is not a very good experience. So in what cases you wouldn't want to invest the time to build a responsive app? Let's say you are building an app for a specific event, or any app that exists for a short period of time, or made for any kind of purpose with an expiration date. In that case, you can make one app, and yes, of course, the experience wouldn't be excellent across all devices, but on the other hand, the purpose for the app's existence is going to end fairly quickly. On the other hand, if you do have a situation like we discussed before, an app that is used for running the business across multiple devices and multiple roles, then yes, maybe it does make sense to invest in a responsive app. Sometimes you might find yourself in a situation where it's actually better to build two separate apps than one responsive app. For example, if you have multiple roles using the app on different devices, but for entirely different purposes, and just having the data in common, well, perhaps just create two different apps instead of trying to fit in all that functionality into one app. So the point I'm trying to make here is that building a responsive app is definitely possible, but you should consider whether you want to make the investment to do that. I have linked below several resources on that topic, a general Microsoft article about building responsive apps with PowerApps, and a link to Truly Responsive, a framework I've built that helps you design apps that show the right UX on any device at any time. In fact, the example we saw on the previous slide was built on Truly Responsive, and you can get that demo app in the same repository. So let's talk a bit about navigation. We have here three examples of navigation. We have here the search bar on top, the search bar in the bottom, and the search bar in the bottom, but the navigation menu is on top. So is one of those better than the other? Let's take a look at that. In the first example on the left, we see that we have the search bar on top, we have the menu items on the bottom. That means that if I hold the phone in one hand, then it's easy for me to reach the menus at the bottom, it's easy for me to scroll the map, but it's more difficult for me to reach the search bar at the top. In the second example, we have the navigation items at the bottom, we have the search in the bottom as well, and we have the map at the top. So in this example, it's easy for me to reach the navigation areas, it's easy for me to reach search, but it's more difficult for me to scroll the map because I have less reach. And in the third example, we have the search on the bottom, the map in the middle, and the areas on top. So in this case, it's easy for me to search, it's easy for me to drag the map, but it's more difficult for me to reach the areas on top. Depending on how I use the app, one of those solutions can actually work for me. For example, if I often navigate across areas and I need to explore the map, but I don't use search all that frequently, well, then this first version will work perfectly for me. If, on the other hand, I do search often, then the second version will work for me. And if I search often and mostly use the map and rarely use any other areas, then that third option would be perfect for me. So as we saw in the first slide, there's definitely wrong ways to go about navigation, but there's also no one right way to go about it. The right way depends on how the people are going to actually use the app, and that is something that we can find out by asking them, as we discussed in the previous chapter. In a similar way to UI prototyping, you can also prototype the navigation of the app. You can talk it over with the users and decide which features should come first, and which features can be placed somewhere deeper in the menus. So, as with UI prototypes, you can actually prototype that as well. Most websites you would go to have something called a sitemap, which is the outline of all the sections and the areas of that website. The same thing you can also do for UX. So in that case, that would be a UX sitemap. And that can look something like that. You have the primary areas, you have the secondary areas, and then with each secondary area, you have additional functionalities that users will not use very often. And you can build this outline fairly easily, discuss that with the users, and decide what comes first, what's second, and what third. Burgers, waffles, and meatballs. It's not lunch break yet, this is still UX design. There's a lot of different icons that we collectively understand to mean something. The floppy disk is save, X is close, question mark is help, and so on. When navigating modern apps these days, you typically see those three icons: the waffle menu, the burger menu, and the meatballs menu. So the waffle menu is typically something that is more high level. It's something that allows you to navigate between applications in an application suite. You would also see that in the Office application suites, in Dynamics, in Power Platform, and so on. The burger menu is a menu within an application that allows you to navigate across areas of the application, go to settings, options, or other areas. And meatballs menu is typically a contextual menu within an app. Usually the expectation is that it gives me additional options on the screen where I am. For example, I can select a text, tap the meatball menu, and get options like copy, paste, and so on. It is somewhat different in Google design language, where this menu is presented vertically and is known as the kebab menu. So, how do we present data? We see here 4 different options of how data is presented. And based on the example with navigation, you probably have figured out that none of those options are wrong. For example, let's look at the first option. That looks on the surface fairly ridiculous. But then we think about, wait a minute, what if this app is primarily used in a car, in landscape mode? You would want the items to be bigger and easier to reach. In the second example, the items are clearly presented in such a way that they should be used in portrait mode, but we can also see that each element is big enough to tap while you're on the go. It's an app that you can use at the office, but certainly not in motion. And the last example is a way for us to present data in such a way that it is reasonably condensed, but still is able to show us meaningful visual data. Like for example for a field service agent or a delivery person. Color harmony. This is actually a subset of color theory. We're not going to go too much into that topic. I just want to touch upon several things that are applicable to apps. So how do we know what color combinations work when we build an app? You don't have to invent that. There's a certain science behind that. We have several types of color models that create good contrast and are pleasing to the eye. We have the complementary color scheme, which are 2 colors opposite to each other. We have the split complementary, which is 1 color on top and then 2 nearby colors opposite to it. We have the analogous model, which are 3 colors close to each other on a color wheel. We have the triadic, which are 3 colors on a color wheel with an equal distance between them. We have the tetradic, which are essentially 2 complementary models side by side. We have the square, which are 4 colors at equal distance from each other. And we have the monochromatic model, which when we use 1 color, but of different shades and different tints. On the topic, the difference between tints, shades, and tones. A tint is when you add white to a pure color, a shade is when you add black to a pure color, and a tone is when you add gray to a pure color. When we use almost any color model, whether it's complementary or analogous or tetradic or whatever else, we have to use colors of the same tint, shade, and tone, otherwise those colors would not combine well. The only exception is the monochromatic model, where tint, shade, and tone are the only ways to differentiate between the colors. Let's look at the example of the Citibank app. In this example, we can see a blue monochromatic palette. The only place that is not blue is the Citibank logo, and that appears only once on the login screen. Let's look at the ING app. It is also a monochromatic design, but one that uses an orange palette. In this case, the logo is not shown anywhere aside from the splash screen, because we have the branded orange color to remind us where we are and what app that is. In the KBC app, we see that primarily for all the elements, they use a blue monochromatic palette. However, they have added a few photos here to create a certain atmosphere. And we can see that the photos are actually tuned to be in a complementary palette of blue and yellow. The McDonald's app uses an analogous color palette of red, orange, and yellow, which echo the colors of the brand. You would also notice that the way data is presented in this app is different from the banking apps. McDonald's doesn't sell numbers, it sells burgers, and it wants you to notice them. Another important point in how we use colors is that colors have weight, meaning that depending on what color that is, it can be more or less perceptible to the human eye. For example, at first glance, that might seem that all those texts are the same size, but actually the yellow text is the biggest one. And even though it is side by side with the red one still seems a bit bigger. So you don't really have to guess which colors go well with each other. There are actually a lot of tools available for you to help with that. I provided here a link to a fairly simple tool that allows you to select the model that you want and find the colors that you need. So what we have learned from the examples that we saw is that most apps and even most organizations will not use very complicated color models for their designs. In fact, the vast majority of the apps that you will see on your phone will be monochromatic. There are of course apps and brands that use more complicated models, but they are somewhat less common. Well, maybe just the one. Now let's briefly touch upon text and fonts. Fonts primarily fall into 4 categories. You have block letter, which is based on the style used in early printing presses. You have script, which tries to emulate handwritten text. You have the serif, which is stylized text with different widths. And you have those elements on each letter, which are called the serifs. And you have the sans serif, which typically have strokes with consistent width and no additional design elements. So in a way, it is the simplest expression of text. In fact, if you look at the vast majority of the content that you consume on a daily basis, you would see that most of it comes as sans serif. The reason for that is simple. It is just a font category that allows you to consume data on smaller screens in the easiest way possible. If we look at those 4 examples, we see the same text presented in different font categories at the same size, but as you can see, one of them is much more readable than the other. So in the first example, in sans serif, the font takes the most space and is probably the most readable. With the serif font, it is somewhat readable and it could go over on a larger device, but on the phone, not so much. Script makes reading text even more difficult, especially on smaller devices, and black letter makes it outright impractical. So beyond having your logo in black letter like the New York Times, it's really not good for anything else. Now let's look at the way how we place text on the screen. We have the example on the left, where text just flows as it is, and we have the example on the right, where text is divided into different paragraphs. If I were a person that was trying to skim through the text, I would probably read the first and second and maybe third line of each paragraph on the right, but I would probably not even bother reading the text on the left. So coming from that experience, I would get much more information from the right than from the left. And when you present text on the screen, you should build it in such a way that it draws focus to the areas that are more important. We have discussed the different color models that exist, the complementary, analogous, tetradic, triadic, and so on. But in each one of those models, there's something called a key color, which is the color that is used primarily and decides what other colors are going to be used. And most organizations do have that one key color. In fact, this image is a pretty good representation of how brands align on the color wheel. So, based on everything we discussed, you would think that you have a lot of decisions to make regarding colors, fonts, and so on. But in fact, for the most part, you don't. Many organizations, especially large organizations, will have something called brand guidelines, which dictate exactly how logos, colors, fonts should be used in any situation. This information is not always public, so it's difficult to give good examples, but I have found a few examples for Netflix and Instagram which are public and give guidelines around the placing of the logo. This is of course most likely a small subset of the brand guidelines, but that's what we have. So there's a few ways to show off your brand. There's the explicit way, you can just plaster your logo all across the screen, or there's the implicit way, when you're using colors, fonts, and shapes to remind the user about the brand. You would notice that in the mobile apps examples we looked into, most of the times the brand is shown implicitly. So Citibank, for example, doesn't place its logo on every screen and every button. Let's look at 2 examples. We have here a text. It says cool brand, but it also uses a font that is very reminiscent of a well-known brand. I don't have to write Coca-Cola for you to know that it is Coca-Cola. Or let's look at the sequence of those colors here. If you ever used any Google app or use an Android device, you probably know that those colors means Google. So there's a lot of ways to remind the user about the brand without actually placing the logo everywhere. You can make that connection between the brand and the color and the font on a splash screen or a login screen and let the user make the connection between all those elements. Because within the app itself, especially if it's a mobile app, you don't want to sacrifice content space for branding space. Responsiveness and performance. There are several UX design related considerations that apply to performance, like artificial wait time. So we discussed that there are opportunities to show off your logo, but don't create those opportunities in an artificial way, like loading screens that takes more time than they have to, or long splash screens. If you have a process that takes time to execute, Be transparent about it. Show a loading bar or a loading screen, or let the user that they are waiting for something and not just block the UI. The way you should typically process business logic would be in the background, if it's technically possible, and not interrupt the process flow of the user. I'm all for making the UI beautiful, but keep in mind that if you add a lot of assets like images and graphics, that will just take longer for your app to load and for every screen to load. So always keep a balance between graphical assets that enhance the experience and those that just slow the app. If you do have a long-running process, and it is in the foreground, and it does not allow the user to do anything else, always have an option to cancel that process. Don't put the user in a situation when they have to shut down the app and restart it again. And some final thoughts. As I said in the beginning, the point here is not to make you a professional UX designer. So the first thing I would advise you to do when you build an app, just open your favorite app store and look for similar apps. There's bound to be one there across millions of apps that does at least similar things to what you want to do. And if that design is good enough, well, take inspiration. Combining the experience of others and brand guidelines, which hopefully you will have, can give you all the tools that you need to create an app design that is both beautiful and functional without reinventing the wheel. Remember that when you build an app is not the content. The content is the content. The app just needs to be functional and enable users to navigate that content and generally stay out of the way. People will usually use the app not to stare at the magnificence of the buttons you designed, but to do a job. And you, as an app designer, should make it easy and enjoyable for them to do just that. I've added here a few resources that you might find useful. So we discussed that there are several color wheels already available that you can use. There's a simple color wheel. There's a more advanced color wheel from Adobe, which allows you to create your own color schemas, general information about responsive design in PowerApps, link to Truly Responsive, my framework to create responsive Canvas apps, and as an example, logo guidelines for Netflix and Instagram. And this is it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you found it valuable, and I hope to see the great apps that you will create armed with this knowledge. If you have any questions or just want to show off the apps that you made, you can always find me on LinkedIn. Thank you and have a lovely day.